Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was May 10th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt cara companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. When I first looked at the document for today, it's in Joan's secret seal register. I saw it as just another long Latin commission of some kind that I could just ignore. And then I got to the probata. And the probata makes it so that this document is actually a pretty important one in my overall research process, and it is also a document that might shed some light on whether Joan has recovered as of May 10th from his near-death illness from April 28th. So, before I get to that probata, let's just look at the document itself. The addressee is not very clear. It seems like it's a commission that would be given to a fellow named Johan de Murcos. So on the first page of this document, on folio 61R, in line 8, we have the name Johan de Murcos, and it's pretty clear that what follows in this document is authorizing him to go get money. And it seems like it's going to be a substantial amount of money. The reason is that this document makes it clear that the place that Johan de Murcos is going to collect money from is the church. And so that requires a little bit more explanation. So at this time, I don't know exactly when this started, but the tithes, and so when I say the word tithe, people are going to have all kinds of connotations come up and understandings. Tithe is basically when the church collects money from the parishioners. And I think most people imagine that in most times and places that money would stay with the church. It would go to the larger organization that the church was a branch of, or it would stay within that one congregation itself, that one institution, and pay for the upkeep and I don't know if there's staff, like salaries of staff, or pay for the food that feeds the people who work for the church, and then also it could go to paying for some of the church's charity activities. And I think in a lot of times and places that was the case. Now, in the Crown of Aragon in the 14th century, there were a lot of different taxes and fees that originated in one form and then really drastically changed, but kept the name from what they were before. So one example is the Cana tax, C-E-N-A. That tax was one that related to certain hospitality rituals and functions, and the vassals of the king would sort of contribute to the hospitality needs of the the king if he came to town. But then over time, the traveling part of it kind of fell away, and the cana just became like another tax that people would pay. And it wasn't related to the dinner, which is a translation into English of the word cana. And so it was just another tax. Now, the tithe, by this time, appears to have become simply a tax that the church had to pay to the king, which is really different than what you might have initially thought when I said the word tithe. So the scholar who I'm drawing from on this is Marta van Landingham, who wrote a book, Transforming the State, 1213 to 1387, and there's the title's longer than that, but basically it's all about the Crown of Aragon and how the state became more of a bureaucratic enterprise from the 13th century into the 14th century. Now, what's interesting is that the period that she has identified in her subtitle ends right at the year that we are discussing. The reason being, she decided that she would end her historical investigation with the reign of Per the Ceremonious. Because if we look at 1213, that is the start of the reign of Jaume the First, also known as James the Conqueror. And he's the one that actually established the chancery as it existed at the time that we're studying. The life story of Jaume I, the James the Conqueror, is really interesting. As a very young person, like in childhood pretty much, he was like a hostage. And he was held captive pretty much by a papal legate. So there was some kind of deal. I can't remember the exact details of this, but basically part of the deal was this papal legate would raise Jaume, and the expectation was that, I guess, like, he would not become king, but things happened, and he became king. But while he was growing up and was in the custody of this papal legate, he got to witness how the papacy organized its correspondence and its archives. And so he brought those practices and the whole idea and importance of documentation to the Crown of Aragon when he became king. And as the territory of the state expanded under his rule, he instituted these practices of documentation and was able to grow them because of the abundance of paper. And then later kings, they built and built and built upon it, and then Per the Ceremonious, during his long 50-year reign, he really went wild with documentation, and the whole archival and chancery practice just ballooned during that time. And that explains a lot of why we can do a document for every day of a king's reign in a particular year, pretty much from 1350 all the way, up until maybe like into the, I don't know exactly what year I would want to pin this down, but into the 15th century. The archival and chancery practices were really strongly well established during the reign of Per the Ceremonious, and so the historian Marta van Landingham decided to investigate the growth of the state and this bureaucracy. So you can imagine there's a lot of great information in that book about the chancery. So I'm currently reading it now, and it's going to really help to inform a lot of the things that I'm looking at in the future, but for today's document, I just want to pull out one statement that is on page 122 of Transforming the State by Marta van Landingham, which is that Van Landingham says that by the 14th century, the tithe had become a tax paid by the church to the crown. So when we are looking at the word tithe, or when we're looking at some kind of collection of funds that are coming from the church to the king, then what we are looking at is this tithe practice. So the word tithe takes on a kind of different meaning here. And in this document, we see that Johan de Murcos has been authorized to be a collector. So he's going to go around the kingdom and get money from all these churches. And you can imagine that that's quite a lot of money that's going to come in. So I think that what we can see here is a consequence of something that came up in the documents that Joan had sent to the Pope earlier on. And that's because in the first line of this document, we see the name of the Pope, Clemente. It's at the end of line 1 of this document. And so what I'm guessing is that the Pope, by the time we get to May 10th, has created a document, and we do have in line 3 at the end, we have like third word from the end of the line, in bullis. So there has been a papal bull, and I believe that ruling from the Pope has authorized Joan to collect more money from all of the various ecclesiastical institutions in the realm, and that Johan de Murcos is going to be the one to go around and get a lot of this money. Okay. Now, someone appears at the end of this document on line 8 of folio 61V. We see the name it's something like, Petri de Beniorem. That is the scribe. That is the chancery scribe who is actually also in the probata. So that was interesting, but that's not the most important thing about the probata statement here. So it appears that Per de Beniore is not only somebody who copies down documents, he's also somebody who's going to be in a management role or an organizer role for the various funding streams that Johan de Murcos is going to be in charge of. Because it looks like in this part that mentions Per de Beniore, there's also different types of financial instruments connected to what he is expected to do. And I will just mention really quickly on the, fifth line from the bottom of the document, there is a word that really jumps out because I've seen it a bunch of times in connection with the financial problems of the reign of Joan and Violante. About four words into the line, Mogubellis. The Mogubels were infamous. They were high interest loans, like really high interest. Like they could be like 30% interest, which is just unimaginable. So these particular loans were the ones that really, if somebody at the time or later was looking to criticize Joan and Violante for very, very bad financial mismanagement, this is the instrument that they would point to and say, look at all these mogabels that were at these outlandish interest rates. And so when we see that word, that is like a red flag that, okay, we're getting into some financial trouble spot here. And it is somewhat connected to what Pere de Benlliure is going to be doing as the money comes in from this new activity managed overall by Johan de Murcos. There's some other financial words that appear in this document that show that there's just going to be a lot of administration going into collecting this money. So there's going to be apocas, there's going to be receipts. So if you look on folio 61R in the 8th line from the bottom and the 9th line from the bottom, you'll see those financial terms. So anybody who's interested in understanding the way that the government taxed and its financial streams in really great detail, I think this document would be very useful to you. But my interest is not primarily in the economic nitty-gritty, although I do get interested in that. My primary interest is in to what extent Joan and Violante were ruling together. And I've said hardly anything about that this whole episode, and now we return to the probata. So the second line of the probata is pretty straightforward. It's a classic mandavit mihi Pere de Benlliure. So he was writing about himself. And from what we have learned from Tranx y Ordenya and Arago in their book on the Chancery, when in the probata we see mandavit mihi, like we do here, it means that the origination of the document was from the monarch themselves. And I use that word themselves intentionally because of what's happening on line 1 of the probata. Line 1 of the probata, it reads Dominus Rex, Lord King, and then we've got an abbreviation with the letter P. I'll get back to that in a second. And then after that, Domina Regina, the Lady Queen. Okay, so they're both in the probata. So in some respect, they created this document together. Joan and Violante created this document together. But it all hinges on what that abbreviation, that letter P, stands for. And wouldn't you know it, it's not easy to tell because the abbreviation is one that is the beginning of many, many words in Latin. So when you see that little diagonal loop above a P, it is almost certainly a PRI or a PRE or a PRAE. Those are your options. You cannot say that this is a PER because that would be indicated by a horizontal stroke through the descender of the P. You cannot say that this is a PRO because that would be indicated by the little curl off to the left through and then back around through the descender of the P, like we can see a pro a highly stylized pro in the symbol of the probata that occurs below the second line of the probata. So this is a word that begins with either PRI, PRE, or PRAE. Those are our options. And there's a lot. There's a lot of options. So when trying to figure this out, I think something that I would really need is somebody who's got a ton of experience with these documents. I think they would know for sure. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a guess based on something that I have seen in the document just above. In line 3 on this folio, about 5 words in, praeterea. So now in this situation, the P is not abbreviated. It's PRE spelled out. And then we've got the T with the same kind of diagonal loop that indicates like a ER or like a R, something going on with an R. This is what you see for ter, like terra, like land. But in this situation, it would be praeterea. Praeterea means a bunch of different things, actually. But one of the meanings is thereafter, or another meaning is in addition. It could also mean besides. So that's the cluster of meanings that we have, which is basically saying that there's some kind of association happening, and it could just be talking about combination. It could be talking about one person handing it off to another person, or one entity handing it off to another entity. So that's the cluster of meanings around praeterea. And I think that we have something like that going on in line 1 of the probata. So what we're seeing here is that violant is involved, and it could be that this means the king and thereafter the queen, which if we kind of play that out in our imagination, violant, okay, this is a possibility. I'm not totally sure about this, but I believe that this probata can indicate that the document has in name originated from Joan, but that it was the queen who was the one that commanded it to Père de Beniore, or who is the one who's kind of been... So Père de Beniore is saying, mandawat mihi, the queen gave it to me, but came after the king. So that's my interpretation. It would totally fit in with the idea that Joan is still very weak and that he can get the ball rolling on some things, and then Violant will flesh it out in conjunction with good old Francesc Sacosta, who is the vice chancellor for Joan. So what I'm getting from this, even if Joan is not all that weak, is that we have got these 4 people. They are all involved in creating this document: the king, the queen, the scribe, and the vice chancellor. And this is not one of those probatas where it's come from the counselor or the vice chancellor himself. It's coming from the monarchs. It's really, the authority here is the monarchs, and there's no getting away from it. So I don't think that anybody could argue, as I have for some other documents with other wording in the probata, that the king and queen were never aware of this. I think that this probata is pointing us to the interpretation that the king and queen were highly involved in creating this, but it might not be that they were equally involved. So if Joan is still in a very weakened state, then this probata to me would make perfect sense. And Violante, according to what we're seeing here, is right there doing this work of governance to open up a very substantial and important funding stream and to help them solve their money problems, which I think their money problems started just fast and furious at the beginning of their reign. I think they arrive, they get there, and it is not very long at all before they are told you've got massive money problems. So they write to the Pope and say, hey, you need to let us collect more money from the churches in our land. The Pope eventually says yes, and now we're getting the gears turning with getting that money. And then maybe it's going to be going to paying down some of the Mogabel debt. I'm not quite sure. Somehow the scribe is involved in the organization of this or the monitoring of it. Not quite sure. Johan de Murcos is in charge of going and getting this money. I don't think he's on his own doing that. I think he's got to have people to help him, but to what extent? Or maybe he is on his own. Don't know. All these questions come up, and part of it is material that I could figure out from this document itself once I get to wrestle with it more and really become more certain of the Latin grammar. And other parts of it are just not going to be accessible from any of the documents, other details of this process. But this particular document, at first glance, it is just an economic, bureaucratic arrangement. But then just that little probata statement opens up this entire relevance to my big question of to what extent was there co-rule happening between Joan and Violante. One last quick detail. This is in the secret seal register. The second to the last line ends sigillo secreto municam. Municam. I looked up that word. It's an adjective for secured or safeguarded. And so we've got not just the secret seal here, but it's basically saying that it has been secured by the secret seal. So there's like an additional level of protection for this document. It's interesting why that would be necessary. Well, maybe a lot of money is involved, and that's why. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.